Hello students, it's your history teacher and I'm here with another online lecture from the unit Czechoslovakia between the years 1945 and 2004. Today I will talk about two topics and it will be the period of the 1950s and its main features, because this era is the very essence of the communism in Czechoslovakia, we can say. And the second topic will be the Prague Spring, the period of reformation of the system of the 1950s that was in fact unsuccessful in the end. So I will start with the 1950s and its main features. So I will mention several points that were essential for 1950s, and you should know all of them and to characterize them. The first one is nationalization. This means that the industry or a company was put under the control of the government, which became its owner. This included confiscation of flats and houses, so the former owners lost these properties and it was nationalized, so it became to be owned by state. The next one is connected to it, but I want you to distinguish between them. It's collectivization. Collectivization means joining several private farms, industries, and so on together, so that these are controlled by the community or by the government. So it can sound really similar to the nationalization because it also was put under the control of the state, but collectivization means that it was joined together. So all of these private farms of private farmers, ordinary people, were bought for just a little money and then joined in the state farms. Po slovensky ide o klasické družstvá, jednotné roľnícke družstvá, ktoré mali skratku JRD. Toto je veľmi typické a chcem, aby ste si to pamätali po slovensky. Jednotné roľnícke družstvá, or state farms in English. So they were joined and controlled by the community or by the government. This was also kind of infamous because on these huge farms they were growing the monocultures. Ide napríklad o monokultúrne polia repky olejnej. To sú tie žlté polia, ktoré môžete vidieť popri ceste. A pokiaľ ste v súčasnosti zachytili debatu o tom, že tieto monokultúry škodia napríklad včelám. To znamená, že nie je rozmanitosť, ale teda sú obrovské polia plné iba jednej rastliny, ktorá sa pestuje. Toto bolo práve zavadzené v 50. rokoch. Okay, so I want you to distinguish between nationalization, which was mostly concerning the industries, companies, and personal properties like flats and houses, mostly for building another infrastructure. So it was really well known that the communists bought flats and houses for really little money, and these people were afraid that, maybe they can take it from them. Then they confiscated the flats and houses of the collaborants, and when they owned these properties, they could just build there something else on this land. So it's mostly concerning this kind of properties, and collectivization was concerning mostly private farms and lands that was joined together into state farms. The next point is command or planned economy. So I know that you know this one really well. So this means that production prices and incomes were dedicated and fixed by the central government, and there were plans set to the future. So for example, this 5-year plan, so you just had to stick to the plan that was given by the central government, and you couldn't make your decision according to the situation on the market that, was usually really flexible. Ide o taký jednoduchý princíp ponuky a dopytu, ktorý poznáte z ekonomiky, kde teda ide o to, že v klasickej ekonomike, ako máme napríklad my dnes, čiže v trhovej ekonomike, sa na základe dopytu ľudí tvorí ponuka. Čiže o čo majú zákazníci záujem, to sa predáva a to môžu dostať. Naopak, v tej plánovanej ekonomike to funguje tak, že čo sa vyrába, čo je nastavené v pláne, to ľudia musia kupovať, lebo nič iné nie je. So this is very the summary. That command planned economy is fixed for a certain amount of time and it's directed by the central government. Next is the term class enemy. So class enemy was a person in opposition to the official regime, and there was the hunt on these class enemies. So we know that, for example, this were the Democrats, former fascists, but also the clergy, also intelligence, and so on. So the next point, the actions, is concerning one of the class enemies that I've mentioned, the clergy, because actions meant the liquidation of monastic rules. There were two actions, action K and action R. Akcia K znamenala akcia kláštory, čiže zameraná na mužské kláštory, akcia R na reholníčky, rehole, čiže na ženské rehole. Action K meant the dissolution of the monasteries and rehabilitation of the monks. So all of the monasteries were closed and the monks were forced to work usually somewhere as builders and to do like the manual work, manual labor. I know one example when the water plant and dam was built in Nimnice, and the monks and the students from the seminar who studied theology was sent there as workers. So they were forced to do the manual work there. But it was not only for them to work, but also their civil rights were violated. You know, for example, on Fridays, when the religious people, mostly like monks, didn't eat meat, there was always meat on Friday, you know, as a punishment. It was made on purpose, you know, as a persecution and their rehabilitation. So they wanted to re-educate these monks to become good communist citizens. Okay, so to not behave according to the church and the monastic rules, they wanted to re-educate them by the work. They were saying that the work is the best medicine. The same happened to the nuns. So their convents were dissoluted and they were sent for re-education as well. They were rehabilitated, but they were not working as manual workers somewhere, but mostly they transformed them to nurses. Because also before, the main occupation of the nuns was taking care of the poor and ill. Also, I have to mention that during the communism in Czechoslovakia, the disabled people were persecuted as well because they didn't fit to this communist image about the healthy youth and great communist nation, you know, so usually they were hiding disabled people at home. So they couldn't work, and people were just hiding their disabled family members at home and pretending that they're not even exist, and they were taking care of them just at home. Okay, so that's why we also do not have barrier-free entrances in a lot of buildings, because they were built during the communism where these people were just persecuted as well, you know, so they were not taken as the equal citizens. So these nuns were transformed to nurses that should take care of these people in some facilities. Okay, you need to know just what is there in the presentation, but I think it's good to know the background of it. The next point is that the Black Barons were created. Black Barons were soldiers of the Czechoslovak People's Army who were not trusted because of their origin. You know, in Czechoslovakia, you had to go to the army, to join the army for 2 years, and these Black Barons were soldiers who were former kulaks, aristocrats, capitalists, so we can say class enemies. Talking about this, I really recommend to you to watch TV series The Black Barons. There are more episodes. I've put a link there to the presentation for the trailer, so these are the best scenes, but I really recommend it to you because you will get the essence of that period from this series, you know. It really says a lot about the whole communism and also about these Black Barons. It's also a comedy, so maybe during the summer or evenings when you will have nothing to do, it's great to watch. And the last point from this slide are the labor camps, where the eradication of undesirables was taking place, and the most famous labor camp was Jáchymov in the modern-day Czech Republic, and these were uranium mines. So people had to work there, and I do not need to tell you that when they spent a lot of time in Jáchymov, there were terrible consequences for them because most of these people had cancer from these mines and died during their imprisonment or after. But there are some survivors of this labor camp that survived without any consequences because maybe they had a strong immunity before. There are great stories about this in postbellum. So it was also very cruel. So these class enemies were sent to work there. Okay, now we'll move to the next slide to talk about great part of the 1950s, and these were the show trials. Show trials, as its name can tell us, were the trials that were just made for public because in the beginning of the trial it was already decided about the fate of the accused. In Czechoslovakia, these trials were introduced during the era of Stalinism, so after the victorious February in 1948 and 1955, so until the Stalin's death, and they were really absurd, organized only to threat people for political reasons and not for finding the truth, so this was not justice. Show trials led to death of 248 people of Czechoslovakia. The best known trials of the 1950s were two. Okay, I want you to know these two processes. The first one was with Milada Horáková. There was an anniversary a few days ago, I think. She was a Czech lawyer, politician. She was feminist, we can say. She fought for the rights of women, and together with her group, she was accused of high treason and espionage, and as the only woman, she was executed for this made-up crime. Okay, so she didn't commit high treason or espionage. She was just accused and executed for it, so she was hanged. There was a movie released about her and her trial, I think 1 year ago. I haven't seen it yet, but when you're interested in how, in this case, you can watch it. It's called Milada. The second of these show trials was Monster Process, and it was called because this was the biggest show trial of 1950s. During this process, communists were accused of bourgeois nationalism, and among other motives for this process was anti-Semitism, because majority of these accused communists were Jews. So during the era of communism, even the communists were not safe, because as you can see, the 11 communists were accused of this bourgeois nationalism. So again, just made up case. These 11 were executed. So there were more people accused, but 11 of them were executed. Among these executed were Vladimir Klementis and Rudolf Slansky, who are the most famous of these executed communists. And then there were others who were sentenced to long-term imprisonments, for example Gustav Husak and Ladislav Novomysky. You should be familiar with some of these names. Vladimir Klementis was in the party when the communist takeover of 1948 happened. Do you remember the photo I showed you when there's Klementis standing just next to Klement Gottwald on the balcony in Prague, announcing the socialist revolution? Rudolf Slansky was even general secretary of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia between the 1945 and 1951. But he had some conflicts with Antonín Zápotocký, and also he had Jewish origin. And, there was Stalin's pressure on finding the enemies within the party as well. So these two were victims of these made-up show trials. Also, Gustav Husak and Ladislav Novomysky were imprisoned. Husak was later president, and Ladislav Novomysky was famous writer, author, and publisher. What was brutal about these show trials was that the victims of them were not even buried. They were burnt and their ashes were scattered at field near Prague. Communists did that because they didn't want the graves of the executed martyrs of communism to become memorials for others to visit it. The communist regime caused directly the death of 6,000 people. These were shot when they crossed border, or they were drowned in the Morava River when they tried to swim through. They could also die because of the border electric fences, and many others who didn't die personally experienced the injustice of the totalitarian regime. So the 6,000 people died when they tried to escape from the communist Czechoslovakia. I've put a link to the documentary that is called The Lost World of Communism, and I want you to watch that because it can give you a bigger picture about the whole period. It starts with the 1950s. There are also these processes mentioned. There are interviews with the daughter of Milada Horáková, with later president and former dissident and former dissenter Václav Havel. And this document ends with the Velvet Revolution that will be our topic for the next lecture. So I want you to watch that now or in the end when you will revise, because it will be a great help to you. Okay, so be sure that you'll watch that documentary. Here I have the pictures of Milada Horáková when she was arrested. So this is her. And this is the picture of Klement Gottwald that you have already seen in this presentation, right? But I promise that I will put it there one more time because now I want to show you something. In the picture on the right, there is Klement Gottwald and Vladimir Klement is standing on the balcony announcing the socialistic revolution. So this is victorious February. It's the original photograph. But then something happened and we have there another photo when there is just Klement Gottwald. Why is that so? Vladimir Klement was airbrushed from this photo because the communists wanted him to be forgotten. He was executed because he committed treason and this bourgeois nationalism, and so Klement Gottwald couldn't be portrayed with him standing side by side in the most important event for the communists. Okay, so that's why he was airbrushed. This was a common practice to do that. Also, Stalin did that with many of his former colleagues, who then turned into the enemies of the state. But one thing is still an evidence of Vladimir Klement in this photo. And it's the fur hat that has Klement Gottwald on his hat. Klement Gottwald used to drink a lot, and before the victorious February, the story says that Gottwald with Klementis had a little party, and Gottwald didn't go home after the party, and in the morning, when there was cold on the February day of 25th, he borrowed this fur hat from the Klementis. So this is one thing he could not erase from the photo. So by this, I want to point out that there were many attempts to change the history, and many people erased. So we do this not to forget them and to keep our collective memory, because this is what politicians usually try to change, and people have tendency to forget about the bad things, but we have to remember them. Okay, so I hope you will remember this. I will not put it into the test, but anyway, I want you to remember that people used to be erased from the history. The next topic I will talk about is the Prague Spring. So after these 1950s that were really characteristic about the communism in Czechoslovakia, The 60s, at least the early 60s, were the era of stagnation, economic problems, and the low standard of living. The president of Czechoslovakia was Antonín Novotný, and he was unpopular communist leader. Mostly he was unpopular among the Slovaks because he had quite controversial relationship with them. There were some signs that he didn't show respect during some official events in Slovakia, and he was usually very hostile to the Slovaks, so he was unpopular among the whole country and especially the Slovaks. So there were many people unsatisfied with the situation. So during the mid-1960s, the demands to reform communist regime appeared, and the process of liberalization, so reformation of the regime, peaked in spring of 1968 when the reformer communists replaced all Stalinist politicians. And name of this reformer communist was Alexander Dubček. He became the General Secretary of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia in the spring of 1968, so this was the highest function he could have in the country. And after his appointment, he introduced to Czechoslovakia the socialism with a human face. It was put into the practice by the action program of the government, which allowed small private businesses freedom of speech, assembly, press, movement, and possibility of multi-party government, so introduced pluralism. So Dubček wanted to preserve the communism, but with some improvements, so he could see that people are unsatisfied in the country and he wanted to solve their problems. So he wanted to give them their own civil rights. People were really enthusiastic about this change, but also they were skeptical. After all these show trials, actions, and the witch hunt on class enemies, they didn't believe it from the beginning. But they still had hope, so this is why they were mostly really enthusiastic. However, the USSR was not so much. Its leader, Leonid Brezhnev, was really disappointed with the situation in Czechoslovakia, and by using the conservative communists in Czechoslovakia, like for example Vasil Bilak, the USSR arranged the invitation of the Warsaw Pact forces, where there's invitation in quotation marks. Well, they arranged it that way that it seemed that Czechoslovak government asked Warsaw Pact forces to come to help us because there are demonstrations and that somebody is trying to arrange the takeover. But this was not true. It was, again, just made up. So arranged. So the Warsaw Pact forces like the USSR, Hungary, German Democratic Republic, Poland and Bulgaria came to oppress the counter-revolution. K tomuto vám poviem ešte taký zaujímavý príbeh, neviem, či ste o tom počuli. Vasilovi Bilakovi, ktorý teda zabránil reformácii komunizmu a teda spolupracoval s Moskvou a v podstate zradil reformných politikov, ktorí sa snažili zaviesť socializmus s ľudskou tvárou a teda pozval vojska Varšavského paktu, ktoré prišli a zostali tu ešte ďalších 30 rokov, tak jemu odhalili sochu, bustu a pomník v obci Krajina Bystra, to je v okrese Svidník na východe, a teda v jeho rodnej obci. Urobili tak rok po jeho smrti. S odhalovaním tohto pomníka nesúhlasili viacerí občania, nesúhlasil s tým ani Ústav pamäti národa, pretože tento muž bol teda skôr neslávne známy. Napriek tomu tento pamätník bol postavený. Na to zareagovali dvaja umelci, sochári, Peter Kalmus, ktorý si už aj počas komunizmu prežil svoje, a druhý aktivista Luboš Lorenc tento pamätník natreli červenou farbou a na deň napísali touto farbou slovo sviňa. Za tento čin boli odsúdení na 2 mesiace vo väzení, nepodmienečne, a na zaplatenie peňažnej pokuty. Stalo sa tak celkom nedávno vlastne. Pomník odhalili v roku 2015, pamätník odhalili v roku 2015. This will also not be in the test, but is for your general knowledge. So after the revolution, the Prague Spring was suppressed. Dubček, Černík, Smrkovský, the main representatives of the Czechoslovakia and also of these reforms during the Prague Spring were arrested by the Russians and taken to Moscow. They could only come back to Czechoslovakia after signing the Moscow Protocol. This meant the capitulation on all reforms they passed before. So when they wanted to go back to see their families, they just had to sign this Moscow Protocol. So they did. Here I have some pictures. So in the top left picture there is Alexander Dubček. Next to him, in the top right, there are demonstrations in the streets that were protesting against the occupation of the Warsaw Pact forces. And in the pictures, in the bottom line, you can see how the people were demonstrating in the streets. So there were tanks when there was written, "Russians go home," or "Give us our freedom back," and also Dubček, Intake, Bilag and Barbirek. This was another politician that was cooperating with Bilag. So that there was really short period that people were really enthusiastic that something is happening, it's on a good way, and then the Russians came in the tanks. After Dubček's return, he still occupied some important functions in Czechoslovakia, but in 1970 he was expelled from the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia and all other organizations. The communists took his passport and military rank, so they took him everything. He spent almost 20 years in isolation, watched every day and begged, working as an ordinary worker manually for minimum wage. In spite of Dubček's demand not to resist, more than 100 people were killed in the streets, and the country was occupied by the Warsaw Pact forces until 1991. So even after the Velvet Revolution, so it was until the USSR was dissolved. As the reaction to the intervention of the Warsaw Pact forces, 70,000 people fled the country immediately, and later this number, 70,000, arose to 300,000 immigrants. The 1968 showed the necessity of reforms of the communism, but the attempt of the regime to do it itself was a failure. This was because all of the satellites were controlled from Moscow. And without the acceptance of the Moscow, there was no change that could be done. Foreign Western powers did not risk the open conflict to protect people of Czechoslovakia, but there were many protests all over the world. I've even seen some videos from India and Asia that were people holding banners that were saying like, "We are with you, Czechoslovakia." So they wanted to support it, but in fact they didn't want to risk this conflict because, as you know, there was Cold War and the main powers were too afraid of the Med to risk any conflict like this. The waves of demonstrations became less and less intensive, and people slowly accepted new reality. The new reality after 1968 was the restoration of the old form of communism. This is what we call normalization, what will be the topic for our next online lecture tomorrow. The caricature that you have in this slide is pointing out the difference between the relationships Czechoslovakia and the USSR when we were liberated by the Red Army, and the relationship when a lot of people were killed in the streets, as I mentioned, more than 100. Here I have some pictures from these events, so what you could see in the streets during that time. There were many signs and many memorials created just by the people on the places where these people were killed. Máte teda napríklad táto strela zabila 40-ročného muža a položené kvety, dátum. To isté, tu zabili ruskí okupanti 17-ročné dievča. A tieto miesta sa stávali pietnými miestami, čiže sa tam nosili kvety, ľudia plakali, nosili sviečky, čiže takýchto miest bolo veľa aj v Prahe, aj v Bratislave, hlavne v týchto veľkých mestách, ale aj v iných mestách. Po všetkých mestách v štáte sa objavovali nápisy, napríklad čo Čech to muzikant, čo Rus to okupant, nech žije Dubček a podobne. So that's it for today's online lecture. And I want you to know just the most important things. So for example, the main features of the 1950s, so there's normalization, collectivization, class enemy, labor camps, actions, show trials. To know these two show trials that I mentioned with Milada Horakova and the Monster Process, I want you to watch the documentary about the communism that I posted link for. Also the basic things about the Prague Spring, so when did it happen, what does it even mean, the main representatives, what does mean socialism with human face, the reforms that were passed by the action program, and the occupation of the forces of the Warsaw Pact. So that's it for now. So study on regular basis, because there will be just one more lecture and then there will be big test next week. So keep on doing good work. Bye.